Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm your host, Kendra Cordova, and today we have another exciting installment of the Progressive Islam curriculum that is brought to us by the ANA Foundation and MPV, so shout out to them for making this possible. We're actually going to go over the second half of the unit. This is Unit 4, Reading the Quran as a Progressive Muslim, and we're specifically going to go over verses today in the Quran that cover everything from freedom of religion, equality, and nonviolence. So these are really big topics when it comes to the core of Islamic belief, and so we're going to take a look at what that says there in the Quran and how we can understand the Quran, including some of what people might consider to be some more problematic verses or controversial verses, and trying to understand how, as progressive Muslims who are here and see the world as a place to share love and justice and peace, what we can take from the Quran on all of that. So just like with the previous classes, we're going to be taking a look at not just the Quran verses themselves, but also just like what a bunch of different scholars have to say. Now, aside from some of the very specific beliefs within Islam, like, monotheism, that God is one, that the Quran is the word of God, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is messenger of God, aside from some of those very specific core pieces of Islam, you're going to find a wide array of different scholarly interpretations on pretty much everything else. And that's good. That's actually a huge part of Islamic history, is when you go and you look at like the diversity of Islam, the way it is practiced and understood and interpreted throughout time and throughout different cultures. So we're going to take a look at a bunch of different progressive scholars that might agree or might disagree on some things, and we're going to try to understand what we can take out of it and how to approach it ourselves. So first section we're going to go over here is lesson 3, and that's going to be freedom of religion and belief in the Quran. So at the heart of human rights in progressive Islam is the belief that all individuals have the right to live life in accordance with their own beliefs and safely in their own identity. Freedom of religion and belief, whether it be the freedom and practice of one's religion as a minority, or freedom to interpret religious texts in accordance with one's own human experience, is often considered the root of society that affirms human rights. So obviously, as progressive Muslims, we do believe in social justice. We believe in justice for all. We believe in equity. And some people believe that this is incompatible with Islam. However, when you look into the Quran and some examples from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the earliest Islamic sectors here that were set up, different groups, different towns, different tribes, whatever that was for them at the time. The Islamic groups, especially in early Islam for their time, were considered very pluralistic and very open to different groups, religious groups. So oftentimes you would find groups that were being persecuted near Islamic areas actually moving to more Islamic areas because it would allow them the freedom of religion. So we're going to take a look at where the Quran says that and what we can understand about it. So the first verse that brings this up is we're going to look at Quran 2, verse 256. So that's Surah 2, Ayah 256. This is very commonly talked about one. It says, "There's no compulsion in religion. The proper way has been made clear from the wrong way." So when I have these conversations in a variety of Muslim circles, one of the things that you'll hear from a more conservative viewpoint is that this line specifically means that there's no compulsion in somebody becoming a Muslim. However, once they are a Muslim, we now have the right to tell them how to believe and how to do everything. And if they disagree with us, then they're wrong and they have to conform. They have to conform, right? That is an incorrect interpretation, which I'm going to get into here in a minute. But it specifically is that there is no compulsion in the way a person must believe, because it says the proper way has been made clear from the wrong way. Now, a good example of this, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is the idea that if you take any other idea outside of religion here and you say, let's talk about the whole round earth versus flat earthers, right? So let's say you believe that the earth is round, that it is a sphere, right? This is your belief. You've read the science. You've maybe known people who are scientists. You've, tried to look into the evidence and you're like, the earth is definitely a sphere. There is no need for you to either A, not be around flat earthers because they might convince you otherwise, or B, have to physically attack and force somebody who sees differently than you. You have your evidence and you know what is true, and you can present said evidence to people, but you know where your truth is, right? And you also understand that you got to your truth through research and understanding. And for other people to get to where you are, there also has to be that knowledge base. There has to be those experiences to get there. But there's no need for this, like, either fear of having to stay away from those people, or this idea that, like, you will beat them into submission into believing that the earth is a sphere, whatever that is. So let's talk about how some scholars have interpreted this verse. So Abdullah Sa'id, Sa'id's general reading of the Quran uses ijtihad, which we talked about previously. Ijtihad is the belief that you can independently interpret Islamic texts. You think about, like, especially anything prior to the last, like, 150, 200 years, when travel was difficult, when you couldn't just, like, pick up a phone and talk to somebody on the other side of the world, like what we're doing here for this class. You have to have some ability to understand how the Quran or, your faith fits into your own daily life or your own group or this own situation, because you're not going to send a message asking a question to a place that's going to take 3 months for it to get to, and then you're eventually going to hear back, right? You need to understand how to interpret things on your own. And so Abdullah Sa'id says that it's important to have this independent interpretation of Islamic text, also known as ijtihad. So he believes that faith is an individual's choice between an individual and God, establishing a general principle of the voluntary nature of belief that identifies religious freedom as an essential part of Islam. He goes on to say that forced conversions in Islam are unacceptable, and individuals who do not practice forced conversion, versus persuasion to convert people to Islam, are ignoring a core teaching of the Quran. So obviously, we've talked about this. I bring this up all the time with the Hadith Qudsi, right, where it talks about the way that a person has to, like, approach Islam from their heart, that even if they're doing all of the actions, if they're not doing it from their heart and their faith and their actual belief, it doesn't actually count. You can see that also in Hadith that say things like, Allah doesn't look to your face or to your clothes. Allah looks to your heart and your deeds, right? It's very much an internal thing. So even if you force someone to do something, it doesn't mean that they're actually doing it, and they're definitely not doing it for the right reasons. And if you are a believer here in Islam, in this truth, you would want people to understand or connect with that truth and be doing it from a good place, right? There's no way in which forcing someone to do something is ever okay, and it also doesn't make sense if that is your goal, right? It's also important to note that sometimes Muslims will have this idea here that they are, you have to conform to the majority, but majority rules, or this idea, it's a logical fallacy that, a large group of people believe something and therefore it must be true, doesn't flow if you zoom out here. And then you're like, okay, but Muslims don't make up the majority of the world's population. So if majority rules, it doesn't work if you include all people. So we really need to focus on this internal, personal example and stop trying to make it like an external thing. Also, the idea here is that forcing people to do something for a religion isn't unique to Islam, and it doesn't automatically make it correct just because you believe it's so true that you need to force someone. I can give out a million examples, but in the Muslim world, let's think about something like the Crusades, right? We look at things like Spanish Inquisitions. We look at groups today that will use this coercion to get people in. It's very common, actually, throughout all sorts of systems. Believing that something is so true that you will make someone do it isn't an Islamic principle. It's not something that's unique to Islam in any way. And just remember that if somebody gets into power, even the best type of people, it has been shown throughout history that power corrupts even the best people. So just because, someone in power might seem to start out having good intentions, we also need to double check, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we feeling this way? And why are we encouraging people to act in a certain way? Is this really something that comes from the heart, or is this more of like an anxiety and a control because somebody got enough power to finally, do that to people? Abdullah Ahmed Anaim says that as an affirmation that the Quran states that no person shall be compelled to believe in any particular religious practice. Religious practice that arises from coercion or compulsion to believe is not authentic, which is what we just talked about. And because of this, the coercion associated with the practice, this is because, according to Anaim's understanding of this verse, religious belief logically requires disbelief to present a juxtaposition to what an individual believes. That it is a matter of choice that the individual themselves makes, and Anaim expands this understanding of the verse in a way that can also be applied to governance, asserting that verse 256 also advocates for the separation of religion and state across governments. And that is, again, because once somebody gets into a position of power, this coercion, it's very easy for that to start happening. And, I'll talk to Muslims who love the idea of having, like a Muslim in power politically who is then, using this political power to enforce religion. And I'll ask, but would you be okay if that were like a Catholic doing that? Would you be okay if that was like Jewish clergy? Would you be okay if that was Hindu clergy? Like, doing that same thing? Do you believe that they should have the right to do such things? And of course, the Muslims, just like anybody else you would ask, would say, well, no, only if it's our people, right? If it's not a universal rule in all situations, across the board for all types of people and diverse people, then there's no social justice happening there. And that's that hypocrisy there. I also want to point out that this mentality that when you're trying to force people to believe the way that you do, a lot of the coercion that happens can sometimes be subtle enough that you don't notice it's happening. Eventually, I would love to go into a class, if enough people have interest in it, in the comments on here or anything, talking about cult mentalities and how to identify those cult mentalities within any group. All religions, beliefs, spiritualities, and even non-spiritual groups around the world usually have at least some pocket of like cultish, like a cultish or cult-like mentality. And even if it's just a small portion of that population, it can crop up. And so understanding how to identify those is really important. I just have the really quick note here just to bring it up. And then, of course, I can do something later for this. But if you guys have ever heard of the BITE model, the BITE model was created to help identify and help people identify if they are in some kind of cult. So BITE stands for behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. So the way that a cult of any type, whether it's religious, non-religious, or anything, they will use shame, fear, and this like sense of like self-pride and ego in order to control things like your behaviors, information, what you can and can't read, what you can and can or are told you have access to or are allowed to understand, thoughts, meaning that you will end up like self-policing yourself and the way you think. You'll start stopping your own thoughts and questions to make sure that you don't see anything outside of that group. And then also emotions, again, using that fear, shame, and very strong emotions like that to make sure that you are, again, not looking at anything outside of the cult. Just like I said with the whole flat earther situation, if you are having a belief based on truth, right, you don't need to be worried about running into other opinions because you know how you got to your answer. So again, if you're seeing some of that coercion there, that is very like cult-like control. You need to, keep an eye out for that. Moving on, Amina Wadud, who we've talked about a lot previously, looks at this verse, and Wadud reads this verse as being less about interfaith and interreligious pluralism, and more about intra-religious relationships. So in her interpretation, it's less about like a Muslim and a Christian, or a Muslim and a Hindu, or whatever, and more about this intra-religious, meaning like Muslim to Muslim within the community, and how an individual practices Islam. And if they chose to continue to practice the religion, if they even want to continue to practice, this decision that must be made freely by the individual for them to be considered valid. Because like we said previously, your deeds and the way you are in the world, whether that's religiously or non-religiously, are judged in Islam based on the intention behind them, because context matters. So like, what was the intention behind the person doing it? They're doing it so that their mom doesn't yell at them, or they're doing it so that their community, thinks that they are worth something, and it's not connected to an internal spiritual choice. It's invalid regardless. And so we really need to be allowing people to come understand and experience that authenticity within, because that's really where this concept of the whole like soul and judgment even comes from, is from an internal place, not just doing all of the external things. And then Asma Barlas, who we've also talked about previously. Asma prioritizes the interreligious implications as well. She interprets verse 256 to mean that no Muslim has the right to force any type of religious practice or moral conduct upon other Muslims. Faith is to be considered authentic, and to be authentic, it must be voluntary. This intra-relationship is where you get a lot of the infighting that you see. Muslim on Muslim, well, they're Shia, they're Sunni, they're Sufi, and they do this differently, and therefore they're wrong, and we're right, and it becomes this thing. Your relationship with God needs to be personal, and it's less about what those people are doing over there and more about what you are doing. They always talk about that, like on the day of judgment, right? There's not going to be anybody there to vouch for you. There's not going to be any of that. It's just you and God. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what your neighbor was doing. It doesn't matter what like whoever else around you is doing, because the only thing that you need to come to God with is you. So again, we need to be doing it for the right reasons. We need to only be focusing on that, like you and God going on, and not having 100 people pulling you in all these directions, because again, your focus needs to be on you and God. Reverts. Shout out to the reverts. Reverts probably know this feeling more than anybody else, because as soon as they become Muslims, there's like 100 people on top of them that want to help. They have good intentions, but they are trying to, let them know the best way to do things. And what happens, and this scares a lot of reverts out of Islam pretty quickly when they come in, is that they will be given this list of all these things they have to do, and they'll hear conflicting sides. And again, all of this noise, right? We need to try to reduce a lot of that in our communities. Okay, moving on. One last thing on her, and then we're moving to another verse. So Barlas refers to the story of the prophet Ibrahim. That's told in 37, 102 through 111. In these verses, Prophet Ibrahim seeks the consent of his son Ishmael to sacrifice him in the name of God. Prophet Ibrahim was rewarded for his faith in God, but also for his commitment to seeking voluntary consent from Ismail as a sign of his faith. So this is like one of the core stories in Islam, and I always loved the way that it is told in the Quran for that reason, is that it's this idea that it was this like his son like also had the same dream. His son understood and was like, yes, like we need to follow God, and like this is what is being asked. That consent there is like a key part of the way that the story is told in Islam specifically, and that also has a lot to say about your good deeds and your actions coming from inside. Moving on to another verse, we're going to look at the way Abdullah Saeed looks at Quran 973, which is, O Prophet, strive against the ingrates and the hypocrites, and be firm against them. Their dwelling is hell. What a miserable destiny. So let's break this down. Again, we're going to be looking at a lot of like controversial statements here tonight. So this one here, a lot of people will think that this is saying like anybody who is different or anybody that's not an unbeliever. The Quran regularly brings up the concept of hypocrites, and that is not a religious specific moral phenomenon. That is people. We can see this even within like Islam. Think of any imam or scholar or anybody you've ever had contact with that says one thing, and then you find out either in their private life or you experience them outside of them doing that work. They act very differently from what they preach, right? Think about like political leaders who do this kind of thing. And also think about the idea of when you go somewhere, you might have a society that is claiming to be very like moral and like living for God, but you will see that they still have like thousands of poor and hungry people, right? There's like people in need and people suffering. And if every person in that society is truly living this like moral code, you would think it would be impossible for there to be $1 million apartments right next to people who don't have enough food, right? Like there's something wrong there. So that's where a lot of this hypocrisy comes in. Abdullah Saeed says, to interpret this rather difficult verse requires Saeed to review the various interpretations that claim this verse justifies the oppression of non-Muslims. According to Saeed, the verse is not a call to battle or a call to oppress non-Muslims. It is a call to protect non-Muslims against oppression, Muslims and non-Muslims against oppression, and to protect their right to freely practice. So again, it's specifically talking about like hypocrites and people who are oppressing people and causing problems, right? This is not, again, a religious specific thing. This is just humans doing human things. Let's move on to Quran 2, 190 through 193. This is another one of those like fighting type ones. I have a few notes on here that I want to share for this, but first let's just read what it has to say. So Quran 2, 190 through 193 says, fight in the cause of God against those who fight you. But do not transgress. God does not like the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them and expel them from where they expelled you, and know that persecution is worse than being killed. Do not fight them at the restricted temple unless they fight you in it. If they fight you, then kill them. Thus is the reward of those who do not appreciate. If they cease, then God is forgiving, compassionate. Fight them so there is no more persecution, and so that the system is of God's. So the system is God's. If they cease, then there will be no aggression except against the wicked. There are a lot of things in here. For some reason, people like to grab like just a couple words in there and use that as an excuse to like kill people or harm people. No. You probably noticed multiple times in there, it literally says like the people who are fighting you, or like if they cease, then you cease. All of that. Mehdi Hassan, I was watching one of his interviews about Islam the other day, and one of the ways he described it I thought was absolutely perfect, because he's a progressive as well. But he said that Islam is peaceful in that it is trying to strive towards peace. However, Islam is not pacifist, meaning it does allow for retaliation in certain circumstances. And sorry, just waving bye to some people who have to leave. But yes, it does allow for certain things in certain circumstances. Again, context matters. It's not pacifist in that like you need to just like take aggression and let it happen. Islam is very much about like defending people who are in need, people who are being attacked, people who are being oppressed. And that is where verses like this come in. Asma Barlas, let's go to her again. So Barlas asserts that these verses are not an invitation to aggression, but instead an exploration of how to define oppression and liberation through intertextual reading. Individuals who read violence in these verses are practicing literal interpretation of the Quran and only referencing singular verses or lines to assert the Quran as an aggressive or violent text, which I just noted. As a teacher who teaches like rhetoric and like literary reading, all of the different like levels within that, you can definitely tell the difference between somebody who definitely read the whole book and somebody who just kind of sort of skimmed it or just grabbed a couple quotes from it or something. They're not going to align, right? And some of the wording might be the same or some of the terms they use might be the same, but it's not, you can tell like they didn't get the full story. And that is what you'll see here is people will take like a couple words in there and then they won't actually look at the context around everything. So once this is contextualized, all the teachings of the Quran, including the need to stand up to oppression and the right for oppressed individuals to be liberated, it can be read through a lens of liberation theology. Abdullah Said views this verse, so moving on to him, Abdullah Said views this verse above as an expression of the defensive stance that is allowed by Islam. All verses that speak about fighting adversaries refer to legitimate defenses against political enemies and do not condone one-sided aggression against non-Muslims. Again, after reading that, you guys probably already heard that because when you read the whole thing, it literally says like, God doesn't like the aggressors, the people who start fights. You know, God doesn't want you to just go randomly attack people. If they stop fighting you, you stop fighting. If they cease, you cease, right? Yeah, I mean, I think that one personally is pretty obvious. So not too much to go over there. Moving on to Quran 2, 8 through 9. We have, among the people are those who say we acknowledge God in the last day, but they do not acknowledge. They seek to deceive God, and those who acknowledge, but they only deceive themselves without noticing. This goes back to that Hadith Qudsi I talked about where you have the people who are the reciters and the people who are teaching about Islam. And on the day of judgment in the Hadith, it says that they come and they're like, I learned how to recite the Quran and memorize the whole thing for you. And Allah is like, no, you didn't. You did it for you, right? Like you did it so people would think that you were important or that you were really this holy person. You were doing it for the attention. That is not, that doesn't count. Again, it's about this like intention. So Abdullah Said says that he draws attention to the mention of hypocrites, which refers to individuals who pretend to be Muslim or pretend to be moral in some way because of the opportunities that it could afford them. Again, trying to look good in a community and make everybody like you, and that's not what religion or faith or spirituality or any of that is supposed to be about. He also takes a note on the fact that it does not mention any kind of death penalty in these lines, nor does it call for their destruction. And then he also takes a note of the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad's leniency with people who insincerely converted to Islam, and his prohibition against executing them. So there was actually this hadith that was brought up one time. I was at the masjid, and I really loved it. I haven't been able to find it in my hadith book, so I'm gonna have to go back and like really try to dig through those because I want to find the exact like book and number that it's in. I like to reference those. But the imam there was talking about the story where one of the Prophet Muhammad's people came to him after like a fight. And he had said, there was this guy, and he was a non-believer. And when I had my sword on him, he said that he was going to convert. And he converted to Islam. He does believe, but I killed him anyway because obviously, he was just saying that because I was going to kill him. And the Prophet Muhammad's response was, but were you able to cut open his heart and see what he really truly believed inside? Like, were you able to look within his heart and know for sure whether he believed or not? And the guy was like, well, no, obviously, and the Prophet Muhammad was like, that's right, because only like God can know that. So it's not fair for you to judge someone like that when you don't know what's in their heart. And I really love that hadith. I need to go find it. If you guys know what that number is, or the book, or whether that's the Muslim or Bukhari or any of those, put that in the comments on this video. Let's see. So Said goes on to say, at the time, the Arab Peninsula was dominated by a tribal system, which meant that when an individual left the religion of Islam, they didn't just leave the religion, they also left the Muslim community and joined the opponents who remained committed to the unfair, oppressive tribal systems. That is another thing that's so important to note, is the context of what was going on at the time. I know I've told you guys this previously if you've been watching my videos, but where I actually teach in a very dangerous type area. A lot of my students are gang affiliated. And so that's a form of a tribal system. And what happens is, if you say you're leaving that group, what that means is that all of their information, where they are, their places, their people, all of that. And so if you leave, it's actually considered a life or death risk of letting that person go over to the other side, because they can then turn against your people, right? So that's that tribal mentality, is if you're not with our tribe, you could be with the tribe that's trying to kill us. Yikes. So that's where a lot of this whole non-believer stuff happened, was because at the beginning they were definitely in a tribal area, and they were in a group that was being attacked regularly and in these conflicts. So if you have somebody that leaves, again, that's very dangerous. So that's sort of where that comes in. It's not just oh, my neighbor in our super secular society decided to pray differently, and that doesn't pose a threat to you, right? Also pointing out things like how the Prophet Muhammad treated people and things like that. Let's see, that it's not considered a test without free will, and that is true as well. Moving on to Quran 497, we have, those whom the angels take while they had wronged themselves were asked, what situation were you in? They responded, we were oppressed on earth. They asked, was God's earth not wide enough that you could not emigrate in it? To these their abode will be hell. What a miserable destiny. Now, of course, this talks about people who have the ability to, right? Not everybody has the ability. Yeah. What's going on with my video? Can y'all still see me? There I am. Okay. Sorry, I think my video cut out for a sec. But basically, yeah, those obviously, if you don't have the ability to move, or you don't have the funds, or you don't have the ability to move, that's not what this is talking about. But here we're going to look at what the scholars have to say about this. But basically, the idea is that if you're being forced to do things that are against your beliefs, it is your duty to go to a place, or to create a place where you can live in that way, right? You can see this in the people that say they're not going to fight for an oppressive group. I saw these really great interviews recently about some of the young adults in Israel who didn't want to join, the army or the military in Israel because of the genocide that they are waging on the Palestinians. And so they were specifically no, we're not going to do that, right? And so the idea is, if you're in a place that's trying to force you to do something that's wrong, you should try to go to a place where, you can live life the way you're supposed to, and not just live in this oppressive state and then claim you didn't have the ability to do anything about it, if that makes sense. So Abdel Kadir Auda says that, according to Auda, this verse implies that all individuals are obligated to pursue the faith that comports to what is in their mind and what their heart believes. To Auda, this meaning is so firm that individuals are actually required to actively migrate to protect their ability to believe in their own truth and practice these beliefs freely, regardless of what kind of oppression you are finding yourself or the people around you in. The goal should always be to create that free, that space that is free of oppression on people. And in a lot of cases, a good idea for that would be to go somewhere else, right? Also, it says when they have the ability, again, it's about the ability, when they have the ability to go somewhere else, it is an injustice to themselves because they are not being true to their heart, nor are they defending the religious freedom granted to them by the Quran. Almost done with this section, a couple more. We have Quran 548, which says, "We have sent down to you the book with truth, authenticating what is present of the book and superseding it. So judge between them by what God has sent down, and do not follow their desires from what has come to you of truth. For each of you, we have made laws, a structure. Had God willed, he would have made you all one nation, but he tests you with what he has given you, so advance the good deeds. To God he will return all of you, and he will inform you regarding that in which you dispute." This kind of goes back to that whole like only God knows, right? And we're just supposed to do our best. And our best, like it says there, we're all given something different. We're all given a completely different situation. We're all given a completely different context. You will be judged for what you do, not others. And it literally says like, he will inform you regarding that which you dispute, meaning like at the end of the day, only God has the correct answer, and so only God knows. You just got to do your best. So Oscar Ali Engineer, who we looked at previously in other classes, says not only is this verse an affirmation of religious pluralism, but that it is one that rejects the notion of Muslim supremacy. This verse underscores that God's creation of different laws and different customs and values for different communities are all intentional and core part of God's plan, because God could have easily created one homogeneous community. This diversity, especially as it relates to religious pluralism, is central to God, and as a result is an expression of the divine on earth, and that must be respected. God is never limited. God is unlimited in their ability and creation and whatever they want to do, right? So if God is not limited, then anything that exists, including diversity within the world, is created by God at the end of the day. So remember that as well. Osman Barlas says that her interpretation of the Quran is this line in the Quran 548, that this is a clear indication in the Quran that it acknowledges that other faiths can be legitimate, that this is the presence of diverse religions is an intentional part of God's plan, and the diversity of these faiths on earth indicates the presence of divine creation. So really, we're supposed to like look out there and get to know each other. We've talked about that Quran verse as well. It's a different one, but it literally says like made you into tribes, like scattered you so that you would get to know each other. The whole idea is that if you're not being your authentic self, if you're not being the best you with all of these situations and context and information and experiences that you were given, then you're not fulfilling God's plan for you, because you were made as you weren't made as them, right? If Allah wanted us all to be exactly the same, then they would have made us like the angels, right? Or you don't have a choice. Like you just are doing the thing you're supposed to do all the time. That is not the point of our life here on earth, according to Islam. And it does also say in other parts of the Quran that Muslims are not the only ones that are going to heaven, right? That it's not just like either you're a Muslim or you're not, you're in or you're out. It's like this black and this white. It's much more nuanced than that. It does bring up, like Christians and Jews and other groups as well, that, believe and pray and are good people, is basically what it points out. So remembering that the diversity doesn't have to be scary. Again, some of the people grab onto some of those things and be like, and now that you're a Muslim, you have to do exactly the same thing all the time forever. which causes all that infighting, and instead going, wow, like Allah made that group of people too. That's cool. Let's learn about what that's about. They live in a place or speak a different language or make a different food or dance a different way or whatever that is than we do. And I want to learn about that. The more we learn, and I say this all the time, the more we learn about the universe, whether that's science or the humanities or whatever that is, the more we learn about the world, the more we learn about people, the more we learn about God. Okay, moving on to the next section. We are now on talking about equality. So this is lesson 4, the equality verses. Again, I am going to try to like run through this as fast as possible. I know that this is kind of a long class. So we're going to talk about how, just like in previous lessons, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, the freedom of religion and belief are all underscore one of the most crucial values in Islam, that all human beings are created equal in the eyes of God. And we're going to go over those verses here as well. Starting with Quran 49:13, we have, O people, we created you from a male and a female, and we made you into, hey, look, here it is. I forgot it wasn't this lesson today, wasn't it? O people, we created you from male and female, and we made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another. Surely the most honorable among you in the sight of God is the most righteous. God is knowledgeable. Okay, I literally just brought this up. Yes, that is the verse, 49:13. Let's take a look at what some other people have to say, some scholars. So we have Amina Wadud again. So Wadud interprets this verse to imply that taqwa, which is piety, is the primary and essential only way to distinguish one human from another. Wadud elaborates on her interpretation, stating that God and God alone has the ability to determine an individual's taqwa, meaning that humans should not judge one another's piety. Again, just like that hadith I brought up earlier, like you don't know. You don't know. You cannot look at a person, period. You cannot look at a person and know what their relationship with God is or how God will judge them. You just don't. And wouldn't it be better if like we just assumed that that person might be, you know, someone that God is forgiven and we don't know what's going on with them? So like, why would God want you to go out and treat their creation badly, right? Like they made them too, and you have no knowledge. Like when I see people, I'm sorry, this always upsets me. When I see people that are judging others and claiming that someone's going to hell or that someone's this and that level of pride, that level of arrogance to think that you have the knowledge of God's judgment is personally for me very infuriating, because I cannot imagine walking around the world and having that level of ego to the point where I think I can just look at somebody and like know what God thinks of them or know what God thinks or is going to do. Like that's, I don't know. To me, that is very upsetting. All right. Amina Wadud says that this line is a warning against humans judging each other based on identity, but also on their piety and how their religious practice manifests, if it manifests at all. In her interpretation, she also emphasizes the inclusion of nations and tribes, which to her means race and ethnicity, to indicate that God acknowledges differences between people, but that these differences cannot be used to measure human worth, and they are simply proof of the divine on earth. So again, diversity, God made diversity. That's all you need to know about it. This is common within the Muslim community for sure, because I do see like Muslims that will be going at each other for like coming from a different place or coming from a different background, or people like myself, right, who are English speakers, who come to Islam, you know, well, people point out the fact that I have an American accent or whatever that is, and that makes whatever I'm saying illegitimate. That makes no sense Islamically because, yeah, Quran, guys. So let's take a look at Asma Barlas. Barlas interprets verse 49:13 to mean that identity is no way to distinguish between individuals. Rather, the only criteria to distinguish between humans is ethical moral criteria, which has nothing to do with sex, gender, race, or ethnicity. Barlas believes that this verse comes from morally purposeful action, right? So action, but morally purposeful action, meaning, again, that it has to come from in here. Some of the best deeds in Islam are those that you do without letting anybody know that you're doing them. So like if you go and you like feed a hungry person, or if you go and you foster, some kids, you have like a private, place in the country, and you go and you foster some kids and you help them do their best and whatever that is. Or you make, maybe you have a lot of money and you need to make like a major donation to like a fund for like medical reasons or whatever that is. If you don't tell anybody about it and only God knows, then that is considered like extra special, because you're definitely doing it for the right reasons at that point, right? You're not doing it to get attention. And that's how we should go through the world, is trying to do things from our heart. So Reza Shah Kazemi. It's always the fluctuations on like which syllable should I stress on some of these. I apologize, guys. So Kazemi's interpretation of the Quran are rooted in Sufi thought and their understanding of God's diversity. Kazemi understands that this verse means that one God created the diversity of all individuals, and that this diversity was intentional because it offered individuals a way to acknowledge the divinity of God's creations on earth. Again, diversity is sacred. When you look out in the world, it shouldn't scare you. When you see people that are different than you, you need to look out and go like, wow, like all of this beauty, all of this diversity, all of these languages and art and all these different things were like, all creations of God. I was listening to Maher Zain. I mean, who doesn't listen to Maher Zain, right? But I was listening to Maher Zain earlier, and I'd never seen the music video for The Power before, but I have a friend who lived in Africa for a while, and she actually married a man from Africa, and her family had lived in the Middle East and everything. And that song incorporates all of that. And during the music video, Maher Zain is like on this like safari, and he's like out there looking at all of the different animals and like being in awe of God, of all of this like biodiversity. And I think, we forget that you're supposed to apply that to people too. It's not just a beautiful tree outside. It's not that, but it's the beautiful people that you run into. So Mohsen Kadiver. Again, I apologize. I'm terrible with names. My students always get at me because I can never pronounce people's names right. So Kadivar's interpretation of verse 49:13 is that all people are created and remain equal while on earth. God alone will judge them for their righteousness on earth. Belief in a particular religion does not guarantee salvation. Rather, belief in the day of judgment and the performing of good deeds while on earth in accordance with one's religious belief is actually what determines salvation. Again, in the Quran, it brings up other faiths, right? There are Christians, there are Jews, there are these other people who have belief and do their best and try to live their best in the world. And those people are also saved or pardoned, or however you want to say it, right? Forgiven for sins by God. Oscar Ali Engineer, who we've looked at previously, says that for this section, intentional language around tribes and families specifically is what they like to focus on, that they were created to showcase diversity and to encourage individuals to know and identify each other. Only mark of distinction between individuals is taqwa, or a highly moral person who observes the highest form of justice. Moving on to Quran 45:22, God created the heavens and the earth with truth, and so that every person may be recompensed for whatever is earned, and they will not be wronged. So we're going to look at Farid Asak. Farid Asak reads verse 45:22 to mean that justice is one of the main reasons that God created the universe, with the intention that every individual would reap what they sow and that no individual would be unjustly oppressed. Quran 17:84 say, let each work according to his own. Your Lord is fully aware of who is best guided to the path. That's a really strong one there too, like a really powerful one there too, right? Is so many times we'll be like looking around and be like, oh, well, they're doing it differently. Like they're wrong, or wait, am I wrong? Or the truth is only God knows, and you need to be taking the time to figure out what, it means to be a good person, or what you believe is best, and then doing that as best you can. That's all any of us can do. All any of us can do is our best, right? It might look different, but that's okay. So Musin Hendricks, who we lost earlier within the last year, his interpretation of this was that he recognizes a deeper sense of diversity amongst humans, one that extends beyond race, religion, gender, and sexuality. It's an interpretation of the translation, which means disposition, at the end of the first sentence, where disposition refers to a human characteristic that is deeper than any other regular demographic indicator. This verse speaks to human nature and the importance of being true to ourselves. This verse confirms the divine intentions allow freedom of choice and expression amongst individuals, and that all individuals are equal in their right to express themselves. We can't fulfill the will of God if we aren't being the unique soul that they made us to be. If Allah made you an amazing artist, or an amazing writer, or an amazing doctor, or an amazing lawyer, or an amazing, scholar, whatever it is, and you are not allowed to fulfill what you were made to do, that is inhibiting what Allah had created that person for, right? Getting in the way of that. Now, of course, it's not the person's fault if they're unable to do that because of, certain circumstances. But if you are inhibiting people from living up to their potential, living up to what they are made to do, then you're not worshiping God, because God made this creation, God made this person, God made these people. And saying that they're not good enough because they don't meet your human standards is, again, a level of arrogance that I will never fully understand. Quran 21:47 says that we will place the scales of justice for the day of resurrection, so that no person will be wronged in the least, even if it was the weight of a mustard seed. We will bring it. We are sufficient as a reckoner. I mean, Wadud looks at this line and she emphasizes the use of the word soul in place of person, rather than body or human, to indicate that God only judges individuals based on their actions. Again, that internal soul, rather than their demographics. She also notes that there's no distinction between male and female, black or white, Muslim, non-Muslim, indicating that we are all equal on earth. Quran 17:85, that you shall serve none other than God. I am to you from him a warner and a bearer of good news. Asma Barlas says that this establishes the Islamic concept of Tawheed, which we've talked about previously, which is the indivisibility of God's sovereignty. So God is sovereign of all, right? Any attempt by one individual to establish control or superiority over another individual undermines the concept of monotheism, core to the divine principle of Tawheed. Through this feminist reading of the Quran, Barlas asserts that attempting to deny or undermine the quality of another human is contrary to Islamic practice and the most important Islamic principle, that God is singular divinity. Anytime we put somebody over others as more important or special or as whatever, again, we don't know the judgment, and that works in that direction as well. You, like we talked about with the bite model with cults, you should ask questions. Whatever person you're listening to, whatever scholar you're listening to, whatever imam you're listening to, whoever that is, if they are coming to you and they are saying, I have all of the answers, I am correct, and I know for certain, and that's why you need to listen to me, and you start listening to everything they tell you to do all the time, you're not working for God, you're working for them. Actually, who was it? What scholar was I listening to when I heard this? It'll come to me later. But one of the scholars I saw was giving this really amazing speech on parenthood and what it's like to like lose a child or have like miscarriages or that kind of stuff, and was talking about how our children are not our possessions, right? They are souls that were created by God. You have the blessing of being in charge of taking care of and caring for that life and for that soul. But you do not own that soul. That soul will always belong to God. So this idea that you lost something, like, yes, that loss is something you should feel, that you had this love for this person, but just remembering that we don't own other people, right? At the end of the day, the only control we have over anything is ourselves. We don't own other people, and that includes the people that we like to try to say that we are in charge of and bend them to our will, right? You can see that with some authoritative parents as well. But the idea that like all of us are ourselves, and at the end of the day, we are all equal to Allah. All right. Here we go. Last section, guys. Here we go. Final lesson. Lesson 5, Principles of Nonviolence. So we're going to get into some verses in here that specifically talk about like the whole like war times and some of that stuff that is often used to be like harsh towards others. And we're going to try to understand where like this idea of not being aggressors falls when we look at these sort of things and how we can read these as progressive Muslims. I did make a note up here because for those of you who don't know, I'm actually working on a second master's degree right now in clinical mental health counseling. So I'm spending a lot of time understanding personalities and why people do what they do and the different theories of human nature. And we're looking back at like, how we developed some of the brain pathways that we have now, some of those automatic processes. And when I was looking at like some of the ancient beliefs and systems in like early humans and early human civilizations, and that was sort of like when the patriarchy started becoming a thing, when people went from like hunter-gatherers to like communities of like farmers, and were more established like that. When you're learning about like groups like the Assyrians, like some of the earliest like documented like language and writing down laws and all those sorts of people, comparing that to some of the stuff that you see in the Quran or in early Islam really shows why people say that Islam, for its time, the way that it was set up to start planting those seeds of justice and liberation theology and all of that, while some of the stuff we've sort of like grown out of might feel very harsh, when you compare it to some of those early laws of like the pre-monotheistic, like pagan tribal areas like that, they are very mild in comparison. One of trigger warning, I'm going to talk about some uncomfortable things here, but I did want to give an example just to say people who talk about Islam being progressive will often bring up the idea that previous to Islam, those people in the Arabian Peninsula, tribes, groups, people like that, would often kill daughters, kill baby girls because they were unwanted. They were seen as like not as good as having a boy. Like, where in the world has that, never been heard? Like, yep, we hear that all the time. But there, it was a common practice to like leave a baby or bury it in the desert to die because you didn't want her. And not only did Islam come in and get rid of practices like that, but when you look at some of like the punishments for doing certain things, they were very, very harsh. So we're going to talk about that a little bit in here as well, that this was sort of there to start setting up these options of being less harsh and maybe like finding forgiveness or another way to deal with the situation. So let's talk about Quran 538. The male thief and the female thief you shall mark, cut, or cut off their hands as a punishment for their crime and to serve as a deterrent from God. God is noble, wise. So let's look at what some of the scholars have to say about this. Abdullah Saeed acknowledges the historical and cultural context of the Quran because capital punishment and communal disgrace were accepted forms of punishment at the time when the verse was revealed. We can understand that this punishment to be a measure that would have been effective at the time. In addition to historical context, Saeed reads this verse using intertextuality, which sees him rank various verses according to their importance, which goes 1 through 5, obligatory, fundamental, protectionism, implementational, and instructional. Using this ranking, Saeed is able to determine the degrees of importance of the different verses and whether or not they are fundamental values that Muslims must abide by. Remember in a previous class when we talked about Caliph, I think it was Caliph Omar, who came out and decided not to issue punishments for people who were stealing food because there was a famine at the time and that's what was driving people to steal. And so he would like waived that completely. Again, this goes back to that like context and time period and norms and what is the current situation, right? So even during a time, because he was an earlier caliph, even during a time that would be considered like pre-modern, there are allowances made for coming up with the most peaceful or the most lenient version of how to deal with the situation without having to go to like the full harsh options that were normalized at the time. So moving on, he also says that the aim is about preventing crime and theft from happening again. That was really what it was about, right? To prevent it from being a further issue. Therefore, it is not a fundamental value. Additionally, Said acknowledges the placement of the verse and that directly following this verse is 539. Whoever repents after his wrongdoing and makes reparations, then God will accept his repentance. God is forgiving and compassionate. Repentance could lead to forgiveness, and therefore encouraging a thief to repent for their crime is better than punishing the thief, right? Again, trying to understand where the person is coming from. Why are they doing what they're doing? Working in an area that has quite a bit of violence, like where I am, you really start learning about that, like really trying to take everything that's going on into context, because if you're used to certain things going a certain way and you see this one behavior, it might come across as extremely like extreme or jarring to see. But then when you take everything else that led up to that and what was going on at the time, it can really contextualize like what really needs to be done here. Not just like, oh my gosh, like expel the person or whatever. Oscar Ali Engineer looks at this and he considers the following 3 factors. Distinguish between the normative and the contextual verses. Understand the worldview that people use to approach specific texts. That every text exists in a social context and should be understood according to that specific social context. Let's see. Talking about the concept of cutting off the hands or cutting the hands. There's a few other notes that scholars made on this. Engineer says that this may actually be a metaphor that readers can understand to indicate an attempt to restrain the individual from committing crime in the first place, destroying one's power, or restructuring society or their life in a way that favors individuals who are oppressed and weak and stopping them from driving towards theft to survive. Historical context also presented by Said is that the punishment is indeed literal in his interpretation, but it is a punishment that was specific to the context in which the verse was revealed. Edip Yüksel, another scholar, says that this interpretation needs to be rooted in intertextuality, as he reviews the number of times the Arabic word cut is mentioned in the Quran, which is 36 times throughout. And that it varies often from cutting off things like a relationship or the end of something. And so, like, looking at the way that they're using the word cut, how else could we possibly look at this and contextualize it? And then also a reminder of, like, the concept of it being a deterrent. To underscore this, he references verse 12:31, which tells of a party of women who cut their fingers with knives because they were awed by Joseph's attraction. According to Yuxel, it would be incorrect to assume that they cut their entire fingers off. So when interpreting the verse, we don't have to assume that the verse calls for cutting off the whole hand, but maybe creating a mark on the hands or cut, which will work as a deterrent. If you guys ever been trying to curb a bad habit of yours and you'll have like a reminder like to catch yourself from doing it or something like that, that's another way that like this scholar specifically thinks that something like that could work. And that like a physical reminder of like seeing the scar on the hand or having to deal with the pain of that cut and then the healing process and being like, I don't want this to happen again, so I'm going to remember to try to do this differently, is another way of looking at this, is like more of a deterrent. Looking at another Quran verse, Quran 5:33, it says, the recompense of those who fight God and his messenger and seek to corrupt the land is that they will be killed or crucified, or that their hands or feet will be cut off on alternate sides, and that they be banished from the land. That is a disgrace for them in this world. In the hereafter, they will have a great retribution. Again, it's going to go into, it's really important to note here that it's using a passive voice and it's using the word or a lot. Like there isn't actually like, you must do this. It's more of like a narrative in that way. So we're going to look at that. But again, when I was watching some of these documentaries and some of the old laws and stuff, it gets really, really extreme to the point that like that kind of stuff almost seems kind of mild in comparison. For example, in like the early Assyrian communities, there was this one where like, even though it was okay to leave a baby in the elements if you didn't want it, that was like legal and happened all the time. If a woman had an intentional abortion without the male's permission, then she was to be killed quite violently and not buried because she didn't deserve a burial. So there were like a lot of these, like, you do something that was socially unacceptable and it turns into this like really extreme punishment in these times. So that's also important to note that some of the stuff that would happen at the time was actually, this didn't sound as extreme to the people at the time. In fact, some of these might sound very mild in comparison to what maybe they were used to seeing. So let's see. Edeb Yuxel for this verse says the most important thing that he considers is the use, like I said, of passive voice in the verse, which indicates that these are not instructions, rather they are statements of facts. The verse doesn't direct Muslims to commit violence, rather it's a factual observation that someone goes around committing violence or, causing, all of these problems, that eventually they will be on the receiving side of violence as well. In the same way, like you might warn somebody, like not to do something because something bad is going to happen. You're not personally threatening them, but you are letting them know that, like, warning them, like, don't do that. That's bad. That's not going to end up very well for you. Also says that it has little to do with earthly punishment for misguided individuals and more to do with heavenly punishment for corrupt individuals, as it says, talking about the hereafter here as well. Oftentimes in these verses, it will have that more like matter of fact message. And that, like, for example, like the story of Lot, we've gone over a million times. I have lots of videos on that. If you're watching this later and you want, some more information on the Prophet Lot, go see those videos. But I always found it really interesting that even for the people that are like convinced that like a conservative, um, anti-gay view of this is the correct way, which of course isn't what I or many progressive Muslims or even a lot of centrist Muslims end up believing. If you do fall on that conservative side, I always found it very interesting that they take the idea that God punished those people as an excuse for them to murder those people, when even the Prophet Lut, who was a prophet of God, was never instructed to attack them, or he's not the one that like rode in there with all of his people to like take out the bad guys or whatever. So a lot of times you'll see these, and it's in no way saying like you as a Muslim now need to go do these things. I also find those interpretations to be kind of interesting, because it does feel like they're kind of pulling this idea that they're the ones that need to be doing this out of thin air. Just a couple more and then we're done. Let's see. Quran 489 through 90. This is a long one. But we're going to look at two scholars on this. It says, they hope that you would reject as they rejected. Then you would be the same. Do not take any of them as allies until they emigrate in the cause of God. If they turn away, then take them and kill them where you find them, and do not take from them any ally or supporter, except for those who join a people between whom you have a covenant, or those who come to you with reluctance in their chests to fight you, so that don't even want to fight you, right? Or to fight their own people. Had God willed, he would have given them strength, and they would have fought you. But if they retire from you and did not fight you, and they offer you peace, then God does not make for you a way against them. Again, this context of like, okay, are they actively attacking you, or are they not? Because if they're not, you don't have an excuse to attack people. So Asghar Ali Engineer points out that this verse is what this verse is referring to anyway is not a normal situation. Instead, it refers to a situation of active hostility, and this was revealed during a time of war. We know this because the following verse 490 indicates a violent situation of active warfare. Engineer also calls attention to the conclusion of the verse that says if people are reluctant to fight or engaged in a peace treaty, it's better to maintain the peace. So at the end of the day, what you're trying to get to is peace. Like, yes, we've noted that Islam is pacifist in that it doesn't say that you can't fight back if somebody's fighting you, but the goal is that like we need to stop the fighting as soon as possible. So if they back off, then you back off. If they want peace, then you try to mend and create peace. Any of those more violent sounding things are specifically within the context of war. And not that war is good either. Again, the end goal here is always peace, but that, you have to understand what the context of using any of these verses is. And these ones specifically are surrounded by verses about warfare. Edip Yaxel also maintains that the violence mentioned in the verse is applicable only to a situation of war, which allows Muslims to commit violence in self-defense. All right, we've got one more. Here we go, guys. Last Quran verse of the night. Quran 2, 190 through 191. Fight in the cause of God against those who fight you, but do not transgress. We already saw this one, but we're just reviewing it in this context here. God does not like the aggressors. Kill them where you find them and expel them from where they expelled you. And know that persecution is worse than being killed. Do not fight them at the restricted temple unless they fight you in it. If they fight you, then kill them. Thus is the reward of those who do not appreciate. I also want to note really quick, because we're on this last one, but I want to note really quick too, where it says that persecution is worse than being killed. You could take this, saying that like you should be brave enough to fight because living in persecution is worse than being killed. But I also like to take a look at that and like flip it to the other side of the persecution and being like, if in the Quran or just in life in general, if you ask somebody what's the worst thing you could do, they're almost always going to say kill someone. Like anywhere in the world, that's probably going to be their answer, right? That we have this thing that is so awful as like taking a life, which is, again, awful, even in the context of war. Like, why do you think soldiers have PTSD? Like, It's not good. But even if you take that, even in a that context that like killing is bad, the idea that persecuting someone is worse than that. The fact that there's a line that literally says like persecution is worse than being killed, saying, of course, to the people that are being persecuted, like, you need to be brave enough to stand up and fight. But again, also that the idea that if you are persecuting people, what you are doing to them is worse than killing them. I think that speaks loud and clear to a concept of a liberation theology. The idea that, putting them in that situation, treating them that way, persecuting them like that is worse than killing them. I think that should give oppressors a lot to meditate on, a lot to think about there, if that's really considered to be worse than killing someone. Oscar Ali Engineer takes a look at these verses that we've looked at and interprets these verses of the Quran to mean that the nature of war in Islam can only be a defensive one, not an aggressive one, as this verse clearly expresses that the fighting for God is limited to fighting and defense. To underscore this claim, Engineer cites historical literature highlighting that during the time of the Prophet, the Muslims only fought defense wars and that were started by the Meccans. So when you look at the big wars and the big battles that they had, they were the defensive on those. And then in his analysis of this verse, two conditions for war emerge. So war should be conducted only for God and not for personal ambition, revenge, or territorial expansion. So if you're doing it for power, or you're doing it for money, or you're doing it for, whatever it is that you're doing it for, boredom, you're supposed to be fighting for God, meaning that, especially with this as a liberation theology, looking at it from that lens, the idea that God's people, aka people in general, are being persecuted or oppressed or whatever, and that you need to be going in there for the sake of God and God's creation. As a Muslim, that is your belief, right? You're doing it for the right reasons. You're not doing it for anything that has to do with you and selfish purposes. And then finally, that war should be strictly defensive in nature because God does not love aggression or aggressors. So again, wrapping that up, the point is that you're doing it for a good cause, and a good cause isn't to like kick the other people's butts. Like, that's not the point. The point is we're here, we need to make the world a better place for everybody involved. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to be defensive when the people that you care about, or the people in general, again, not just your people, but people that you see that you're like, wow, that's messed up, that you do have to defend them. But again, you're not allowed to be the one to jump in there and just like start killing people. That's crazy. Finally, last sentence here. Ali Engineer says that kill them wherever you find them, claims that this intertextuality and historical context must be used to better understand them in the phrase does not refer to all unbelievers, but rather exclusively for individuals who were at war with Muslims at the time. So that is the end of Unit 4. So if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. Leave us some comments if there's stuff you want to look at later, videos that you're wanting to see in the future or anything like that. And if you're looking for a great place to get that zakat money, Muslims for Progressive Values is an international nonprofit that works to further the knowledge and the freedom of oppression that we talk about here that comes with progressive Islam. So again, like and subscribe, and inshallah, I will see you in the next video.